Welcome, everyone, to Religion Uncovered. Today, we're diving deep into one of the boldest challenges to Christian orthodoxy, the idea that, what if the Apostle Paul never existed?
That's right. And it's really, really provocative. Like, could one man, or should we say a constructed myth, be responsible for so much of Christianity's blueprint?
Exactly. So, the discussion centers around Kenneth Humphreys' controversial take. He argues that Paul is basically a mythical figure, maybe no more real than, say, Hercules, but revered as Christianity's founding theologian.
It's wild, isn't it? I mean, think about it. His letters make up nearly half of the New Testament, and he's credited with such monumental doctrines like salvation by grace.
Yeah, and when you really look at his story in Acts, oh man, the adventures almost sound like epic fiction. I mean, traveling vast territories on practically no funds, getting into riots, surviving a venomous snake bite, even commanding Roman sailors while a prisoner. It
Yeah.
reads more like an allegory than a factual account.
There's definitely an element of, too good to be true here, right? The narratives seem engineered, almost too neat to legitimize a fledgling religion.
Absolutely. And Humphreys points out it's like all this hyperbolic detail, heroic allegory almost, is put in place to retroactively explain how Christianity went from a small sect to a global movement.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like they needed a miracle worker to fill the gaps.
I wonder, though, isn't there any chance, even, that some historical kernel exists? I mean, even legends often have a trace of reality.
That's a fair point, and critics do note that. But think about it. Paul's self-defense, his repeated insistence on, I'm not lying, attacking his rivals, and cursing them. That kind of polemic stance seems more like a narrative tool to silence alternative voices. It's less about historical accuracy and more about literary construction.
Right. It almost seems as if Paul's entire persona was designed as a, sort of proxy for larger inter-Christian conflicts.
Exactly right. The idea is that Paul was never a sole, organically evolved figure, but rather a composite character invented to give theological coherence, designing doctrines like justification by faith and the death of the law. But it makes you ask, why place that weight on a single character?
And that's where the critique really hits hard. His theology is too fully formed so early in Christian history. I mean, we're talking about developed concepts like salvation and cosmic Christology in the 50s CE before any gospel was written.
Exactly, and it's almost like projecting later theological developments backward in time to endorse a sort of divine origin of these ideas. It's like someone saying, hey, this was always meant to be this way, rather than it evolving naturally. It's a convenient narrative device.
Speaking of convenience, the letters attributed to Paul, most scholars say only about 7 are authentic, and even those are riddled with editing and interpolation. That, really adds to the case that we're dealing with later forgeries or redacted material rather than genuine correspondence.
Yeah, totally. I mean, think about the logistics. Sending a letter to the so-called churches of Asia in 60 CE with no reliable postal system or even clear evidence that these churches existed in the first place. It just sounds like a post hoc justification.
It's almost as if Paul's letters were fashioned as doctrinal essays rather than personal notes. And that deliberate construction certainly casts shadow on his historicity.
For sure. And then there's his purported self-defense, his constant need to justify himself, to argue against other apostles like Peter, and even to denounce super-apostles who preached a different gospel.
Yeah?
That level of defensiveness is kind of hard to reconcile with a genuine, humble historical figure.
I have to, respectfully disagree a bit here. Isn't it possible that such polemical behavior could simply be the mark of a fiery leader of a contentious movement, rather than definitive evidence of fabrication?
That's a good challenge. But even accepting that possibility, the exaggerations in his narrative, like the dramatic shipwreck, his survival of a snake bite, and even commanding Roman soldiers, seem overly theatrical, almost too perfectly mirrored against earlier myths like those of Moses or Jonah. It hints at, a deliberate mirroring of heroic legends.
Yeah. It's like they recycled epic adventure motifs to lend Paul an aura of divine favor. It's almost like a marketing strategy for faith.
Precisely. And then we come to the geographic and historical settings, Paul's alleged journeys through cities like Ephesus and Corinth. Humphreys, who's actually visited these ruins, argues that the reality of those ancient cities doesn't match the outsized impact Paul is said to have had. His presence
Right.
would have, well, definitely left more tangible marks on those cities.
It does make you wonder if the Christian narrative was intentionally inflated for institutional purposes. Was Paul perhaps not one man at all, but a representation of a whole movement of early thinkers?
Exactly that. What if instead of a single apostle, we're looking at an umbrella name for a school of thought, or even a literary construction used to shore up a messy early church history? That shift in perspective completely changes the way we view early Christian development.
Yep. It pushes us to ask, if Paul never existed as a historical figure, then how do we explain the authoritative doctrines he's credited with?
Right, and that's the crux of this argument. It calls into question the authenticity of these doctrines. Were they really birthed by one man's mystical visions, or were they later carefully revised traditions meant to unify various rival factions? It challenges the very basis of doctrinal history.
And if Paul is more a creation than a person, it implies that Christianity's foundational messages might have been engineered to legitimize power structures within the early church.
Exactly, it points to a kind of retroactive construction where the church needed an anchor, an origin story, and Paul conveniently becomes that literary and doctrinal foundation. It's a fascinating, albeit unsettling possibility.
I have to say, while this theory is intriguing, it's also pretty radical. What does that say about other figures, like Jesus himself? If one cornerstone like Paul is mythologized, could other elements be similarly constructed?
That's the inevitable next question, isn't it? It pushes the envelope, suggesting that both Jesus and Paul might be, to some extent, responses to, well, the institutional needs of an emerging religion. It's about narrative legitimacy and authority rather than pure historical detail.
And that creates a lot of room for debate. I mean, if theological concepts were retroactively attributed, then the evolution of ideas like grace and atonement becomes less about divine inspiration and more about strategic retrofitting.
Exactly. It's like a puzzle where the pieces were rearranged after the board was set. You know, it forces us to consider, say, the nature of historical documentation in a religious context. If the primary sources are these epic narratives, then what can we rely on as evidence? It leaves us with more questions than answers.
And that's precisely why this discussion is so vital. By challenging these narratives, we push for a deeper scrutiny of how doctrines are formed and ultimately how history is molded.
Yeah, and whether you're a seeker, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, it really invites everyone to dive a little deeper. The book Jesus Never Existed and Kenneth Humphreys' analyses serve as a gateway to question and maybe even reconstruct accepted religious history. It's both thought-provoking and challenging.
But let's also consider a potential counterpoint here. Even if Paul was a composite or fictionally enhanced figure, doesn't that still underscore the powerful role of myth in shaping collective belief? I mean, myths have always united and guided communities, regardless of their literal truth.
Absolutely. You could say that the enduring power of the Paul narrative, mythical or not, illustrates how stories are used strategically to cement ideas and social structures. It highlights a broader truth about the way human societies create meaning.
And that, in turn, makes the study of these origins not just about debunking one man's existence, but exploring how narratives drive collective identity and institutional legitimacy.
Exactly. It's a reminder that questioning historical narratives isn't just academic exercise. It has real implications for how we understand faith, power, and the roots of our cultural institutions. It kind of forces us to rethink the entire origin story.
So, whether or not Paul was a historical figure, his existence as a narrative catalyst stands. And that's a compelling subject for anyone curious about the intersections of myth and history.
For sure. If this conversation has got you thinking, then dive into the related works, question the narratives, and challenge what you know. The investigation never truly ends. Thanks for joining in this deep dive into one of history's most audacious theories.
And remember, Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep challenging the conventional stories. See you soon.